We've got people making their way in. I always feel like we should have some starter music or something right now, because I think people are always worried that their sound doesn't work if we're all really quiet when they come in. So
right.
Give people a chance to get settled. And then you might or might not hear my kids' bedtime in the background. But you're an hour ahead. Are your kids asleep already?
One of them is asleep. The other two are reading in their rooms for another hour or so. So they one of them tends to come out and interrupt. So we'll see.
I was gonna say, if they're in bed but don't come out, that's pretty impressive as is.
Yeah. It's 50-50 on one of them.
Well, sounds good. Well, so I know we have some other people who will be joining us, but I think we can get started. So good evening, everyone, and welcome to our program, Israel, Things to Watch For in 2021 with Michael Koplow. My name is Rory Picker-Neese. I'm the Executive Director of the Jewish Community Relations Council, and our program tonight is being sponsored by the JCRC and the Israel Center at the Jewish Federation of St. Louis. Our program is being recorded, and we will be taking questions from the audience. So you should feel free to put your questions into the Q&A box at any time, and I will be trying to go through as many of them as possible. So just as questions come up, keep popping them in, and we'll see how much we can get through. I know we have a lot to talk about, so I'm going to jump right in with our introduction. I'm delighted to have with us tonight Michael Koplow, who is the Policy Director of the Israel Policy Forum. Before coming to Israel Policy Forum, he was the founding program director of the Israel Institute. He holds a PhD in government from Georgetown University, where he specialized in political development and ideology and the politics of Middle Eastern states. He writes Israel Policy Forum's weekly Koplow column and edits the Israel Policy Exchange, which is a leading source for commentary and analysis on Israel and American Jewry. And his work regularly appears in Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, The Atlantic, and The Forward, among other publications. In addition to his PhD, he holds a BA from Brandeis University, a JD from New York University, and an AM in Middle Eastern Studies from Harvard University. Thank you so much, Michael, for joining us. I feel like this has become a tradition. For every Israeli election, we have to have a conversation. So I don't know what I feel like the hashtag is like Israel elects 21, and I feel like it should, I don't know, maybe be part one. But
oh yeah, it's going to have to be part one. I'm afraid.
Yeah. So we'll get to the Israel elections in just a minute, but I actually want to kind of start off. So I know we've sort of resolved some of the controversy, but there was like a lot of hubbub maybe a week or so ago about whether or not President Biden had called Prime Minister Netanyahu, and how quickly he was supposed to, and when Obama called, and when Bush called, and when Trump called, and all of that. I want to just kind of use that as a jumping off point to say, like, let's unpack all of this. Should we be concerned about the U.S.-Israel relationship and the Biden-Netanyahu relationship? Like, what's different under this new Biden administration, and what should we be keeping an eye out for?
So first of all, thanks for having me. As always, I always love talking to folks at the St. Louis Federation and St. Louis JCRC. Better in person, but this is fun too. So obviously there is going to be a difference in U.S.-Israel relations under President Biden than from President Trump. And it's obviously a matter of policy. It's also somewhat a matter of perception. President Trump, when it came to Israel, went out of his way to effectively give the Israeli government almost anything that it wanted and asked for. There were some small exceptions, but for the most part, to the extent that the Israeli government had a wish list of things that it wanted from the United States, it got them under the Trump administration. And President Biden is, undoubtedly pro-Israel, describes himself as a Zionist, has known Bibi Netanyahu for, seemingly forever. But I think we're going to see under President Biden a return to sort of American policy toward Israel that is more in what used to be a bipartisan consensus, where you actually didn't have that much variation between presidents, whether they were Republican or Democrat. And that I think is actually going to take some getting used to for the Israeli government and for Israelis. I've written that at the end of the Trump administration that it's sort of like a sugar high that the Israelis have to come down from. And as much as Biden absolutely is going to be a pro-Israel president, it's not the same as what Israelis became accustomed to over the past 4 years. So that's the first thing to keep in mind. The second thing to keep in mind is that it was more than the fact that President Trump essentially gave Israel almost anything that the government asked for or wanted. It was also that Israel was at the top of President Trump's foreign policy agenda. And, people will remember that on the campaign trail in 2015 even, but certainly 2016, then candidate Trump talked a lot about the ultimate deal and, how he viewed this as sort of the culmination of a deal-making career. And then once he was elected president, people talk about personnel being policy. He appointed his son-in-law and closest advisor as, the person overseeing the process. He appointed the top legal officer in the Trump organization as the day-to-day negotiator. He appointed his bankruptcy attorney as ambassador to Israel. And, much of Trump's foreign policy, whether it was high-profile moves like the Jerusalem embassy or, at the end, the Abraham Accords, really centered on Israel. President Biden, his priorities are elsewhere. It's not even that they're not on Israel, it's that they're not in the Middle East. He's concerned about obviously things at home, but in foreign policy, he's been pretty clear that his main concern is in Asia Pacific, particularly with managing the rise of China. He's concerned about reestablishing robust ties with NATO allies. He kind of wants to ignore the Middle East. And so, you have to look at the phone call in that context. Prime Minister Netanyahu, not only was he the first Middle East leader that Biden called, we're now almost a week later, and he's the only Middle East leader that Biden has called. President Biden is just de-emphasizing the region. And so I think you have to put it into that context. And, maybe more than the difference in policy preferences between Trump and Biden, what the Israelis are going to have to get used to is that whatever it is that they want, they're not at the top of the heap. They're not at the center of the U.S. foreign policy process. And when you're used to getting lots of attention and then you sort of have to fight for attention, I think it can be a little jarring. And I think that's really what we saw coming out of Israel. All the concern about when is the phone call coming. It's a different framework for American foreign policy, certainly over the next 4 years.
So I know one of the things that it seems to me, or my understanding is, one of the strengths that Bibi has brought in terms of his role as prime minister has been a lot of the economic deals and the foreign deals that he's been able to build for Israelis. And so I'm curious to shift over now. So we've had 4 Israeli elections with a Trump administration. Do the Israeli elections look any different? Like, does the American change in any way reflect, like, where Bibi's relationship with Trump might have been a strength? Does this shift for Biden change anything for the Israeli elections, or does it take America out of the equation, in which case these other relationships, or am I overemphasizing America's role in this whole thing entirely?
So I think in some ways you are, in some ways you aren't. The way in which you aren't is that during the first 3 elections, Prime Minister Netanyahu used his relationship with President Trump not only as a campaign point, but in many ways as his central campaign point. And what he said to Israelis was, look at all of these things that have happened under President Trump, things that we wouldn't have imagined in our wildest dreams. Nobody else could have gotten that. It's not simply that Trump is friendly to Israel, it's that my personal relationship with him got these things. And people may recall, either if you were in Israel and saw them directly, or it was widely reported that there were huge multi-story election banners before the elections that had a picture of President Trump, Prime Minister Netanyahu, airbrushed to make them look the same height because they're actually not. And they said Netanyahu, it was a Likud campaign poster, but Netanyahu Liga Acheret, Netanyahu in a different league, and really playing up this relationship with President Trump. Now, Prime Minister Netanyahu can't do that with President Biden because A, he doesn't have the same type of relationship. B, President Biden is not as popular inside of Israel as President Trump was. And C, even if he did have that same type of relationship, he doesn't have any real accomplishments from the U.S. In the month that President Biden has been in office to tout, and so it makes for a very different type of campaign. That said, we're now going to be in election number 4 in a span of just under 2 years. I don't think that anybody was going to be voting for Prime Minister Netanyahu on the basis of his relationship with the U.S. at this point, or withholding a vote from Likud and the Prime Minister because the relationship with the U.S. is now different. The attitudes and views of Netanyahu at this point are so baked in that I don't think it's going to matter. And it hasn't been emphasized in the campaign. The U.S. hasn't been emphasized in the campaign. Even issues that sort of relate to the U.S., like Iran, haven't really been emphasized in the campaign. So ultimately, I don't think it's going to matter. But if this were the first election or the second election, I think it would. At this point, I'm not sure it's going to make a difference.
So first of all, remind me, when exactly are the elections? Because I know they're coming up in March, but I don't remember the date.
Exactly 1 month from today, March 23rd.
Okay, so March 23rd. So we have 1 month to go. We have 4 weeks exactly. So what should we be watching for in these new Israeli elections? And maybe you can even add what you think we should be watching for in the next Israeli elections that you think seem to be coming already.
Yeah, and I'm happy to explain why. So what we should be watching for. First and foremost, aside from how you feel about the prime minister, and that's once again the central defining feature of this campaign, I think that what bears watching is really how Israel emerges from COVID, because at the moment, as everybody knows, Israel has been extremely successful with its vaccination program. The infection rate and the death rate is starting to tick downward. In the last couple of days, it ticked up a little bit for reasons that people aren't quite sure, but it's starting to tick downward. And so that is working, but there are still big challenges because there's a large percentage of Israelis who don't want to be vaccinated, particularly younger Israelis who at this point, like younger people everywhere, kind of look at themselves as being immune. And they're still, leaving aside, the actual first order effects from the pandemic, there's also the economic impact. And that is, I think, in some ways actually where more the election is gonna hinge. Israel is now slowly coming out of a third lockdown, and it's been a very draconian lockdown. This week, for the first time, stores and malls reopened, and you can use gyms again for the first time, and hotels and restaurants are going to follow. And the Israeli economy is really it's been decimated, and people are upset about the way the lockdowns were handled, particularly because Israel went on this sort of this kind of yo-yo policies where there'd be a complete lockdown where you literally weren't allowed more than 1,000 meters outside of your home, and then things would sort of very rapidly, instantaneously open all back up, and then there'd be infections again, and they'd close down again entirely. So how Israelis respond to this coming out of this third lockdown, I think is gonna be a big deal. The other thing to really watch are some of the small parties on both the left and the right, and whether they make the Knesset threshold, because the margins for Netanyahu this time, as they have been, but this time I think maybe even more than the other elections, are razor thin. And if he's able to form a coalition, it's going to be 61, maybe 62 seats. And whether he gets there or not is going to be dependent on smaller parties on the left, and you have a few that are hovering right on the threshold. One is Meretz, another is Labor, another is Blue and White, which at the moment literally holds half of the ministries and half of the cabinet seats, but is polling in some polls right at the threshold and in some polls below the threshold. If any of those parties stay in and don't make the Knesset threshold, then that can be 125,000 wasted votes for each of those parties. And Blue and White in particular, there's been a lot of pressure on Benny Gantz to drop out so that doesn't happen. There was a letter that was published in Israel yesterday from almost 200 former IDF officers calling on him to drop out for this reason, and he's been very insistent that he won't. So that's on the left, and if those parties don't make it, then those are seats that go to the right, and that could put Netanyahu over the edge. And then on the right, you have once again a couple of smaller right-wing, religious right-wing parties that Netanyahu convinced to merge into an electoral bloc. It's the party that used to be Jewish Home. They now call themselves Hatzianit Tadatit, the religious Zionism, headed by Bezalel Smotrich, and Netanyahu basically brokered a merger between them and Otzma Yehudit, the fascist Kahanist party led by Itamar Ben-Gvir, because he was afraid that if they ran separately, neither would make the Knesset threshold, and then you have wasted votes on the right. They will probably make it over the threshold together, but they may not. And if they don't, then you have the same situation on the right that is more likely to happen on the left, given how many parties on the left are at the threshold. So it's important to watch these small parties and see how they're doing in the polling right before the election. And I'll just say that because Netanyahu's margins are so razor thin, I do think that the most likely outcome here is another election. There really is no path to a coalition for the anti-Netanyahu bloc, because it just requires a very wide range of parties all agreeing to sit together. And already yesterday, Avigdor Lieberman, who would have to be one of those parties, says that he won't sit in a coalition with or be supported from the outside by the Joint List, which is another one of those parties. And so even if you have 61 or 62 anti-Netanyahu seats, there's really no way to form a coalition with them. So, I think we're most likely going to see another election, but if Netanyahu gets to 61, there's going to be, a very narrow, extremely right-wing government. Otherwise, we'll have a fifth election.
So there's so much to unpack in all of that. Is there any discussion within Israel of election reform or changing the system? I mean, it seems like Israelis are getting tired of going to the polls.
So there is on one small issue. You have to remember that Israelis tried for 3 elections in the late 90s and early 2000s to do direct election of prime minister. They had 3 elections where it was separated out, and it didn't work. It turns out that fine, it gives you a prime minister, but if it gives you a prime minister who doesn't have a majority in the Knesset, then nothing can really get done. And so that experiment was tried, and I don't think Israelis are eager to go back there. The reform that gets talked about is changing the Knesset threshold, and that's something that happens all the time. The Knesset plays with that. It's gone from 4% down to 2%, now up to the current 3.25%. Now, when it gets changed, it's not due to a desire for election reform, qua reform, or good governance. It gets changed to keep sort of undesirable parties out. Usually the Arab parties that now run as the Joint List. And so that's largely why it has been messed with in the past. Now, if you raise it more substantially, to 5% or even 10%, which is something that people talk about, if you do that, you certainly eliminate the smaller parties, and you'll end up with fewer parties that will be bigger, and that will definitely make it easier to form coalitions. But when you do that, there is a trade-off, because within a proportional representation system, as Israel has, one of the benefits to that kind of system is wider representation. In the U.S., where you have 435 congressional districts, that is seen as sort of being good for democracy, because people have an address to turn to, right? You know who to call. You call your representative. In Israel, where the whole country is one district, you don't have that. But the trade-off is that there are lots of parties, and you can vote for a party that more tracks your direct interest or your strong interests or your sort of niche interests. So if you get rid of that, by raising the threshold too high, and you only have a few large parties, but you do that in a way where people don't feel directly represented because they don't have a Congress, a member of Knesset that they sort of can call their own. It sort of leaves people. It doesn't make the election less democratic per se, but it leaves people feeling as if they don't have as big a role in choosing their leaders, and as if the people's voice is being taken away. So there's always a balance with this sort of stuff. That's the reform. To the extent that things get talked about, that's the reform that gets talked about. But the thing I'll say is that amidst all the talk about the need for reform and the system being broken, it's actually not. What's broken is Prime Minister Netanyahu, and I say that because if there were anybody else, literally anybody else at the head of Likud, you would have an instantaneous 80-seat right-wing majority in the Knesset, and you would form a very large, stable government after an hour of negotiations. The first election that Israelis go to without Prime Minister Netanyahu, this won't be a problem anymore. There will not be a repeat election after that. And so in a lot of ways, this is really about a person rather than a system, given his uniquely polarizing nature, largely due to the indictments that he's under and the trial that he's in the midst of. So this system will correct itself when he's gone, but that could easily take 10 years.
So I'm glad you brought that up, because we're getting some questions about that, of the trial, and I saw today it was just announced also that none of that will continue until after the election. I know that's been a factor, and so if you can just, for those who aren't following, give a little bit of an update and maybe speak to the ways in which the trial is a factor within this. And also we have some questions about the oil spill and whether that's having an impact also in terms of the elections and the economy and how all of these are intersecting.
Sure. So on the trials, what's happening is that Prime Minister Netanyahu had been under investigation on 4 different cases, dating back now about 4 years. Ultimately, the Israeli police recommended to the Attorney General that he be indicted on 3 out of the 4, and the actual indictments ended up coming after the second election, before the third election. And so now he is on trial, and he was in court a couple of weeks ago. And what his attorneys argued in court a couple of weeks ago was that the prosecution should not be allowed to present evidence before the election on March 23rd, because, as in every case, the prosecution goes first, and they were afraid that the prosecution would present all this evidence. They would take up a month, and then the prime minister would not get to present his own evidence in his own defense until after the election. And so they argued that that was not fair. And the court indeed yesterday postponed the evidentiary phase of the trial until after the election, so as not to be seen as impacting the results. Frankly, I don't think any of this matters. As I said before, with regard to the relationship with the U.S., these, even more so, the prime minister's indictments are just, they were baked into the cake, I think, even before the first election. He's been under investigation now, and those investigations have been public, as I said, for I think about 4 years. Everybody knew he was going to be indicted. The indictments have now been around for over a year. The trial has already begun. Nobody is forming a new opinion of Prime Minister Netanyahu, either pro or con. If you're in his camp, you're in his camp, and if you're not, you're not. The trial itself, the indictments, I literally don't think at this point are impacting even one Israeli voter. So it's not going to matter in terms of the election. It does, of course, matter in terms of governance. And one of the things that I think we are going to see, because the trial is going to resume as soon as the election is over, the busiest time in Israeli politics actually isn't the campaign. The busiest time in Israeli politics is actually after the election, during coalition negotiations. And then we're going to be in a situation where Prime Minister Netanyahu, assuming that the trial isn't postponed even further, has to be in court for hours every day and conferring with his lawyers. And that's going to impact the coalition negotiations. And I have no doubt that we will see requests to either postpone the trial more, or lengthen the amount of time allotted for coalition negotiations. And it just it raises the point that Netanyahu made when Prime Minister Olmert was about to be indicted, which was Netanyahu argued, I think correctly and very forcefully, that being under indictment makes it impossible to do your day job as your prime minister. And I think we've seen that already, and I think we're going to continue to see it. On the question of the oil spill and the tar that is now on Israeli beaches, unless there was news in the past hour or so that I didn't see, it seems that that spill came from a tanker that was not not an Israeli tanker, not sort of an Israeli accident, and so it's obviously bad for Israeli ecology and the beaches. But I'm not sure it's going to sway many voters. There are parties on the left that obviously have environmental platforms. But it's interesting, within Israel, there isn't really there isn't a Green Party. It's not like you see in Europe. There isn't really a party that's talking about climate change or the environment so much. You see it on the margins, but it's not a huge campaign issue. So I don't expect that this will be a big issue in the campaign.
So we've talked about the American elections and all that's kind of come out of that. We've talked about the Israeli elections, part one of unclear how many more parts there might be and all of that. The other factor in all of this is potentially Palestinian elections. So yes. Does it look like that's happening? What might we expect from that, and how does that impact Israel?
So the Palestinians are also moving toward elections. Now, in the past, when the Palestinians have proposed elections, they have, just take a step back. The Palestinians have to elect 3 different bodies or institutions. The first is the Palestinian Legislative Council, that's the Palestinian Parliament. The second is the position of Palestinian Authority President. And the third is the Palestinian National Council, which is the body that effectively decides the makeup of the PLO, which is for Palestinians, the sole representative of the Palestinian people. So for instance, when Israel negotiates with the Palestinians, it's not actually negotiating with the Palestinian Authority, it's negotiating with the PLO. In the past, when the Palestinians have proposed elections, they have proposed electing the legislature and the president in one election. So, you go just like we do here, right? Elect president and Congress all at the same time. And, that has not worked. It's sort of a risky move within the context of Palestinian politics, particularly since Palestinian democracy is certainly not robust or institutionalized in any way. And trying to pull all this off at once, is incredibly difficult, especially when nobody trusts anybody else. So what they've done this time is they have separated these 3 elections. And so as of now, the elections for the PLC, the Palestinian Legislative Council, are scheduled for May. Then they have elections for the presidency scheduled for July, and then elections for the Palestinian National Council scheduled for August. So, the first question is whether these are actually going to take place. I am supremely skeptical that we will see all 3. I'd say that there's probably a 50-50 chance that we see the first one, the legislative election, actually happen in May. And the reason for this is that you have a bunch of complicated factors. So complicated factor number 1 is the balance of power between Fata and Hamas. It's clear to everybody that in order to have elections, you have to have Hamas participate. There's no point in having Palestinian elections when you have 2 big factions that control the two separate swaths of territory and leave one of them out. And so Fatah and Hamas have basically spent the past half year trying to figure out how they can come up with rules of the game that both agree to so that they can run an election. And they've done a pretty good job. There was actually a document that was leaked a couple of days ago that was supposed to be private, but that basically was a document that was sent by the PA to the State Department saying that Hamas has agreed to abide by a set of conditions, including past agreements and accepting a Palestinian state in 1967 borders with East Jerusalem as the capital, and a whole bunch of other things. So first has been working out an agreement between those two factions, but what's complicating there as well is that while they're both going to run, Fatah wants to ensure that it will come in first, as opposed to what happened in the Palestinian elections in 2006 when Hamas won a surprise. And in a funny sort of way, Hamas wants to ensure also that Fatah comes in first, because Hamas, has had a very difficult time governing Gaza. They're not really interested. They're interested in ruling but not governing. To borrow the title of a book that a friend of mine, Stephen Cook, wrote about Egypt and Turkey. They just don't like day-to-day governance. They're not good at it, and they don't want the responsibility. And so they want to be in the Palestinian parliament, the legitimacy that confers. They don't actually want to win that election. So that's sort of complicating factor number one. Complicating factor number two is that pretty much anybody who's polled Palestinians and done survey research, and this is obviously difficult, particularly in Gaza, but most people seem to think that Hamas has a ceiling of somewhere between 35 and 40% of the vote, which means that if you have a Fatah list and a Hamas list, Fatah wins. The problem is that Fatah is pretty fractious, and right now there is no guarantee they can have a unified list, which, by the way, is what happened in 2006, where Hamas ran unified and Fatah ran a whole bunch of lists. Right now, there are potentially 2 or 3 different Fatah lists, and if that happens and they split the vote, then Hamas doesn't get about 50%, but they'll be the plurality winner, and that'll be a problem. If the Fatah folks are convinced that they can run as one unified list before May, and they have to submit initial lists, I think on March 21st, and then they have to be finalized, I think on March 31st. If they have a unified list, then I think the legislative elections will go forward. If they don't, then I'm pretty certain that they will be postponed, if not outright canceled. And even if those elections do go forward, and like I said, probably 50-50 chance, the presidency is far more complicating, because then you have, it's unclear whether Hamas will put up a candidate or not. If they do, if they put up Ismail Haniyeh, for instance, he has a good chance of beating Mahmoud Abbas, and Abbas is not going to allow a presidential election to go forward if he doesn't think he's going to win. And within Fatah, there is a real move for Marwan Barghouti, who is pledged to support one unified Fatah list. There's a real move for him to run as president, and it's unclear now, signs are pointing to him challenging Abbas as well. So, that makes a presidential election, I think, a much dicier proposition. And so we'll see what the Palestinians ultimately do, but it is possible, certainly, that we will see Palestinian legislative elections this spring. And if they go forward, as I said, I think that they only go forward if Fatah is pretty confident that they will emerge victorious, in the legislative elections.
So on a practical level, what does that look like for those of us who are outsiders, like in America, or then for Israel? What changes in terms of Palestinian relationships with Israel or with the U.S.?
With the U.S., the Palestinians have been working very hard to change the relationship and to turn the page from the Trump years. For all of the talk about President Trump's policies toward Israel and all the things he did, from the embassy to the Golan to the Abraham Accords and all sorts of things in the West Bank as well. In a lot of ways, U.S.-Palestinian relations actually underwent a sort of a bigger tumult, and I think actually had more change than even U.S.-Israel relations. And the Palestinians were pretty determined to start a new leaf under anybody who wasn't Trump. And the tactic that they've taken, even before the election, they were sort of putting all of their eggs in the Biden basket. And so even before the election, they had been talking about reforming the prisoner and martyr payment system, which is a really huge sticking point, not only for the United States, but for Israel as well. And there's a lot of evidence that the reason they moved toward elections was because they thought that it would win them some plaudits among Democrats and in the Biden White House. And they've basically been trying their, and even things like back in February of last year, so a year ago, the Palestinian Authority had cut off all coordination and interaction with Israel over Israeli government talk about West Bank annexation. So the Palestinians had suspended security coordination with Israel, and they had also stopped taking the tax revenues that Israel collects on its behalf and transfers to them. They stopped accepting those, basically creating a fiscal crisis inside of the West Bank. Almost days after Biden's election in November, the Palestinian Authority reversed both of those policies and once again resumed security coordination with Israel and once again started accepting tax revenues, both of which are things that Republicans and Democrats wanted them to do. So they are working very hard to really kind of get on the U.S.'s good side and try to present themselves as not another headache for the Biden administration, and present themselves as part of the part of the solution, part of the coalition of countries that wants to be helpful. So in terms of them in the U.S., the elections will matter because if Hamas ends up winning, that is going to present a real serious challenge to the U.S. the same way it did in 2006, when then we actually actively encouraged elections and it backfired on us. This time, I'm not sure that we're really encouraging them so much. I think there are folks in the State Department who want to see it, but President Biden hasn't said anything about it. The Palestinians are more sort of reading between the lines and reading sort of, it's coming from their own read of the U.S. political system. So, if the elections go off and Fatah wins, then, they will just say to the U.S., here's another data point, you're worried about Palestinian democracy and transparency and accountability, and we were having elections to try to work on those things. With regard to Israel, there's an open question right now as to whether Israel is going to enable the elections to go forward, and they're kind of mixed signals. On the one hand, one of the big excuses the Palestinians have used in the past not to hold elections is that Israel won't allow Palestinian elections to go forward in East Jerusalem. So, East Jerusalem residents, except for a very small percentage, are not Israeli citizens. But because they are residents of East Jerusalem, they're also not under the sovereignty of the Palestinian Authority. In the past, back in 2005 and 2006, Israel allowed East Jerusalem residents to vote in PA elections. Since then, Israel has said that even though there haven't been elections, when they've been contemplated, Israel has taken a harder line and said that they aren't going to allow PA elections in East Jerusalem. The Israeli government hasn't said one thing or one way or the other this time. If they don't, that is sort of an excuse that the PA has used in the past to not have elections when they don't want to have elections. So there's a question about whether Israel will let them go forward or not. The other thing that Israel is doing, which in some ways indicates to me that that they expect elections to go forward and that they have no problem with it, is that in the past 2 months, they have really stepped up arrests of Hamas politicians and actually Hamas members of the Palestinian Legislative Council in the West Bank. Under the theory that if these guys are in jail, they're not running for the Palestinian parliament. There wouldn't be much reason to be doing that now if they weren't actively trying to give Fatah a boost. And there was even a report today that there was a covert meeting between a Fatah official and Likud to try and coordinate, and talk about how Likud could ensure that Fatah wins the elections in the West Bank. The other point to make here is that while obviously Israel doesn't want to see Hamas win an election, there is no question that it has been Israeli government policy now for at least half a decade, if not longer, to actively support weakened Fatah rule in the West Bank and weakened Hamas rule in Gaza. The current Israeli government actually does not want to see those two territories united under one government. It sort of sees it in its interests to keep Palestinian polity divided. And so while I have no doubt that if Palestinian legislative elections go forward, Israel does not want to see Hamas win them. I don't think it actually wants to see Hamas toppled in Gaza. It's actually gone, I'm happy to talk about this more, it's gone out of its way in a variety of ways to actually make sure that Hamas is viable and stable in Gaza. I think that for the current Israeli government, they would like to see that continue.
So while we're talking about the relationship between Israelis and Arabs within Israel and Arabs within the West Bank and the Palestinian population at large, there's been a lot of talk lately about Israel's COVID response vis-a-vis Palestinians and its Arab citizens. And I'd love to kind of cut through all of like the rhetoric around it to actually really talk about what has Israel been doing. I think we referenced earlier that it's really been seen as a leader in terms of its COVID response, but how has that related to Palestinians? And I would say also maybe tying all of these together, because I'm not sure that I even totally know, who is responsible for there are millions of people who are living in the West Bank. There are people who are living in Gaza. Who is responsible for these people? Should Israel be responsible? Should Israel not be responsible? And is anyone taking responsibility?
It's a great question, and as you noted, it's a complicated one to which there's certainly no easy answer, and I'm not even confident there's a right answer. But I'll lay out kind of what the options are. Within Israel, obviously the Israeli government is responsible for vaccinations, and that doesn't matter, whether you are a Jewish citizen of Israel, a Palestinian citizen of Israel, or a Palestinian resident of East Jerusalem. Israel has full sovereignty in all of those areas. It obviously claims full sovereignty in all those areas. And so, there it is unquestionably Israel's responsibility. Now, in the West Bank, in Area C, which is 60% of the West Bank, and where all Israelis who live in the West Bank are in Area C, and where you also have between 250,000 and 300,000 Palestinians, it is also unquestionably, indisputably, Israel's responsibility there to provide vaccines for everybody living there. The reason being that in Area C, Israel is given both full security control and full administrative control. There is no PA in Area C. It's not allowed to be there. There are, as I said, between 250,000 and 300,000 Palestinians in Area C in the West Bank. They aren't citizens of Israel. They aren't residents of Israel. It's a different category than Palestinians in East Jerusalem, and Israel 100% has responsibility for vaccines there too. Where it gets complicated is in the rest of the West Bank, in Area A, which is about 18% of the West Bank, and Area B, which is about 22% of the West Bank. And in areas A and B, you have no Israelis, you only have Palestinians, and it's where the Palestinian Authority has administrative sovereignty. Now, one argument says, and this refers to people who kind of refer to Oslo, the Oslo Agreement explicitly says that the Palestinian Authority has responsibility for healthcare and medical issues in areas under its sovereignty. And so there is an argument that the Palestinian Authority is responsible for vaccines there. The counter argument is that under the Geneva Convention, any occupying power is responsible for providing things like vaccines to anybody living under occupation. There's no question that areas A and B are under military occupation, right? And that, by the way, not my opinion, that's the opinion of the Israeli Supreme Court, which has explicitly defined it as belligerent military occupation. You see, which is why you see some people referring to Geneva, you see other people referring to Oslo, depending on who you think has responsibility. Now, I am a lawyer, but I'm probably the least qualified lawyer in the entire world to actually opine on legal questions. So, frankly, I don't know which of these views is correct from a legal perspective. What I'll say, leaving the narrow legal question aside, is that even if you believe that Oslo controls and that the PA has day-to-day sovereignty in areas A and B. There is no question that the PA does not control its own borders. There is no question that the PA does not have the ability, even if it wants to simply import anything it wants into the West Bank, including vaccines. Every single thing that crosses into the West Bank is subject to Israeli security checks, comes in through an Israeli port. So leaving the legal part aside, from my point of view, it seems that Israel certainly, even if they don't legally have to, certainly needs to be involved in some way in getting vaccines into Palestinian territories. And I'll also add that there is a moral and ethical question here about the fact that, again, whether the PA has some sort of sovereignty or autonomy or not, there's no question that it's not a state. And if you want to sort of dig down into that further, Israel's main argument made just a couple of weeks ago at the International Criminal Court is that the ICC has no jurisdiction over the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, not only because Israel is not a party to the ICC treaty, they signed the or helped negotiate the Rome Statute, but are not a signatory, but that there is no state of Palestine and that the ICC only has jurisdiction over states. So you kind of can't have it. You can't have it every way you want, right? So I do think that even if there's no technical legal responsibility, I think that from my point of view, Israel should be helping out. And the other point of this is that even if you had a hard border, or the security barrier, or the fence around Gaza, viruses and pandemics don't operate that way. And there is so much interaction in the West Bank between Israelis and Palestinians. They're not living in the same places, but for the most part, they're driving on the same roads, and in some instances, shopping in the same places. And there are Palestinian laborers who are working, in all sorts of Israeli communities, both in the West Bank and inside of Israel proper. If you want to get the, just sort of from a purely selfish perspective, even if you don't particularly care about the Palestinians themselves, if you want to keep the pandemic at bay inside of Israel, letting COVID run rampant in Palestinian territories is just a really bad idea. Now, the Israeli government has facilitated some vaccines to the PA. It's also, not stopped Russian Sputnik vaccines from coming into the West Bank. And it's also, not stopped some vaccines going to Gaza, which the Qataris and the Emiratis have been helping with. But, on the other hand, there's plenty of evidence that Israel has excess vaccines, whether it's the fact that that there are now, tons of no-shows at Israeli clinics, or the fact that Israel today agreed to ship 100,000 vaccines to Honduras, Guatemala, and the Czech Republic. So, it seems to me, from if you want to do this smartly and you want to do this in a way that kind of takes any ethical questions off the table, I'd like to see Israel doing what it can to help out the Palestinians with vaccines.
So I have a couple of questions that are coming in, but before I jump to those, I just want to clarify, because just to make sure that I was following. So you spoke very eloquently about what Israel should be doing. So is Israel taking responsibility for Area C? You sort of said like Israel absolutely should, but yes. It wasn't clear to me. Like, so Israel is vaccinating Palestinians in Area C as well.
Yes.
So it's A and B that are much more, you said, are much more complicated. That's where Israel has not been getting involved.
Correct. Now, I don't know what the actual vaccination rate is in Area C among Palestinians, because, and there's a similar problem in East Jerusalem, understandably, many Palestinians, both Palestinian residents of East Jerusalem and Palestinians living under Israeli sovereignty in Area C, or I should say Israeli sovereignty, under Israeli control in Area C, are distrustful of Israel. And so, there's been a problem in East Jerusalem of people actually trusting Israel and not showing up to get vaccines. And I suspect that, although I don't know the numbers exactly, I suspect that there's a similar issue in Area C. But I haven't seen Israelis or the Israeli government question that Area C is its responsibility. I think there has been a question about, because the Palestinians in Area C are not citizens of Israel, whether they have to go first, right? Whether Israel vaccinates its own citizens first and then turns to Palestinians in Area C. But I've seen no Israeli government official or any Israeli argue that the PA has the responsibility for vaccinations for Palestinians living in Area C.
So we have some questions to kind of clarify, I guess, sort of process. So one, and I'm going to merge these together, but I'll ask both of them, of whether or not the PA has to first take the initiative to actually ask Israel to take responsibility in these spaces, or somebody else who's saying that they've read reports that the Palestinians have refused to take the vaccines from Israel, which I'm assuming for this question, we're not talking about the individual vaccinations that you mentioned, but that's specifically like that the PA has refused to take vaccines from Israel.
Right. Yes. So at the beginning, there were reports that from the PA itself and statements from the PA that they did not want to accept vaccines from Israel, and then there were other reports that Israel had offered and the PA had turned them down. I think that was probably certainly happening in public at the beginning. By all accounts now, the PA, has agreed to cooperate with Israel to get vaccines if Israel is willing to facilitate them. But I also have to say, again, as I said before, in laying out the different legal arguments, there's a question of what is what is kind of a legal responsibility and what Israel is narrowly responsible for from a technical standpoint, and there's a question of what is smart for Israel to do. And from my point of view, sure, there can be kind of arguing back and forth about whether the PA should have asked Israel's help at first, or whether they should be thanking Israel for whatever help they're getting. If people want to have that argument, great. What's more important to me actually is that everybody who needs a vaccine gets a vaccine. And as I said before, it's to Israel's benefit and to the benefit of Israelis to make sure that everybody living in this territory between the river and the sea is vaccinated. It's going to help nobody if all Israelis are vaccinated and Palestinians still have trouble getting vaccines and can't get to herd immunity, and the virus mutates further, and then Israeli vaccinations become less helpful, and the efficacy goes down. So I sort of wish, I've written and said this in other contexts, not around the vaccine, but I wish that in general, not just on this issue, that when we talk about Israeli-Palestinian issues, everybody is always focused on rights, on both sides, who has a right to this and who has a right to that. I would love it if we would have more of a general conversation, across the entire American Jewish universe, not about rights, but about consequences. What are the consequences of certain activities, of doing them or not doing them? And I think that particularly with regard to vaccines, to my mind, it's just a much more fruitful conversation to have about what are the consequences of certain policies, as opposed to what are the very strict and narrow legal responsibilities involved.
So in that vein, and this might end up being our last question, just looking at the time, can you speak about Israel's decision to vaccinate African asylum seekers and how that was accomplished?
Yeah, so I think that that's probably partially actually a result of the Abraham Accords and the agreement with Sudan. Partially because there have been traditionally Sudanese asylum seekers inside of Israel, but also because Israel is actually hoping to, even before the Abraham Accords, the Israeli government and Prime Minister Netanyahu in particular has spent a lot of time in Africa and trying to establish relations, formal diplomatic relations with a number of African countries. So I think that part of this is geopolitics. And part of it is, in the past, leaving the Palestinian issue aside, Israel has done a very good job on kind of humanitarian issues, particularly when it comes to this sort of thing. You think about Israeli first response teams, when there are hurricanes or earthquakes or natural disasters, And I think that this sort of thing is actually something that Israel generally does very well, particularly when you can remove sort of the Israeli-Palestinian component out of it and the politics out of it. And this is an example. And just to connected back to what we were talking about before, I sort of wish that the way Israel is very good about doing this sort of thing when it comes to other at-risk or vulnerable populations, I sort of wish that we would see the same thing with regard to the Palestinians.
Well, I thank you for all of that. I know there's so much more that we could talk about. I had some other questions to get through, but I am mindful of the time, and I know you're an hour ahead of where we are. So
I've got time. I mean, we've got 3 minutes. I'm happy to do one more if you've got one more you want to add to the queue.
Okay, so I mean, the only other component, this is maybe a big one, but I'm just going to ask about, so we've sort of referenced some of these peace treaties. We've referenced the Abraham Accords a bunch. Do we expect anything? First of all, I think there's some concern from a transition from a Trump administration to a Biden administration. Does anything change with those peace treaties? And do we see more coming with other Arab nations?
So I'm a little concerned about the fate of the agreements that have already been signed. The reason being that in 3 out of 4 of them, the Emirati agreement, the Sudan agreement, and the Morocco agreement, they required large US policy concessions that were unrelated to normalization itself to get those 3 countries to normalize relations with Israel. So, in the Emirati instance, you had the Emiratis basically get the Trump administration to commit to kind of put the kibosh on annexation for a bit, but you also had this large arms sale, of 50 F-35s and 18 Reaper drones to the UAE, which the US had been unwilling to sell them first. And while that wasn't, explicitly part of the Abraham Accords, it's very clear to everybody that without that, it wouldn't have happened. In the case of Sudan, it's actually, it's more direct and was explicitly part of the agreement. The US had to take Sudan off of the State Department's list of state sponsors of terror, and Congress had to pass a law giving the Sudanese government immunity from all terrorism lawsuits in US federal courts, other than cases arising from 9/11. And the State Department, that part, the state sponsored terrorism list, that the Trump administration could do unilaterally. But they still needed Congress to pass the law on the lawsuit immunity. And when it hadn't happened by early December, Sudan publicly said that if it didn't happen, they were going to pull out of the accord. And in the Moroccan case, again, it was explicit. The US had to recognize Moroccan sovereignty over Western Sahara, becoming only the 2nd country in the world to do so, in order for Morocco to resume its frozen diplomatic relations with Israel that had been frozen since 2000. Now, without those things happening, those agreements wouldn't have taken place. And the Biden administration, I think, is very unlikely to do that sort of thing going forward with more states. That's A. 2, the Biden administration may end up withdrawing, some of these things. The American recognition of Moroccan sovereignty over Western Sahara is actually right now under formal review. And I think that if the US withdraws it, then the Morocco-Israel deal is at risk as well. So these actually aren't as kind of, because of the way the Trump administration did it, which was essentially, as I said, I don't want to use the word bribe because that's too much, but giving these big unrelated policy concessions that may not have made sense for the US, because of that framework, it makes it a lot harder to get more down the road, because if the US is unwilling to do that, once this sort of precedent has been set, it makes it more difficult. That's 1. 2, there aren't that many obvious candidates left without big concessions from Israel. So, yes, we may still get, Mauritania or Oman. But kind of the big prizes out there, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Algeria, Tunisia, none of those countries are going to do it without real Israeli movement on the Palestinian issue, and that makes it much tougher. So I know the Biden administration, based on what they've said publicly and my own conversations with folks privately, they would like to build upon this. It's something they want to do. But even as we saw at the end of the Trump administration, when they were sort of promising that there were going to be another 2 or 3 coming before they left, and they didn't materialize, I think it's going to be a lot harder. Sort of the low-hanging fruit has already been picked, and it's going to be more difficult going forward for this to happen, particularly without Israel making some commitments on the Palestinian front that they may not want to make.
Well, that was a lot of information in a short amount of time. But thank you for making the most of our time. And Michael, just thank you for spending the evening with us. Maybe before the next election, we can actually do this in person, but we'll keep hoping. So I'm going to thank everyone for joining us and put in a special plug. So if you loved all of this information, if you want to hear more, Michael has a weekly column, I believe, right? Is it? And also you could check out IPF's website for podcasts and tons of other information. Just to give a special thank you to the Israel Center at the Federation and Karen Rader for helping to coordinate tonight's program. And we'll continue to keep sharing more information as news keeps evolving, and as things keep happening, we'll do the best that we can to keep everybody up to date, and especially with this partnership with the Israel Policy Forum that makes this all possible. So thank you all for joining, and Michael, thank you for all of that information.
My pleasure, and Chag Purim Sameach to everybody.
Yes, happy Purim to everyone. Good night, all.
Right.